But thank you all for joining us. This is ICUJP for February 3rd, 2023. So there are a couple things that we wanted to talk about. That first off, you can go to icujp.org for any information about the group, and you can also, there's a button there that says donate. And that button is very important because we have a very, very small staff, not in stature, but in number of people. And that your support helps us keep things in line, because we are doing things like updating our Zoom capability. We are we are looking at things like updating how we do social media and moving into different plans to do that. So all of that is very important, especially in a time where no matter what the administration says about May coming up, we are still in a pandemic. So this is how we're reaching out to a lot of people here. So if you're watching this replay on YouTube, if you can give, there'll be a URL that you can do that as well. And I wanted to talk about what we're going to do next week as well. Where the forum is going to be with a group called Casa of Los Angeles, which is a really great organization. They advocate for children and families in LA County's child welfare and juvenile justice systems, which, as we know, in most metropolitan areas, that's very overloaded and very hard to negotiate your way through. So this group has been doing some wonderful work in that respect. So that's what we have going next week. Let's see.
Well, today, in keeping with our having a librarian speak to us on censorship, I'll reflect both on what I think of librarians as well as my personal experience with censorship. First, on librarians. My favorite writer is Eduardo Galeano. When I started a 3-week one-to-one Spanish course in Guatemala, my teacher assigned me to write a letter for homework. I think she probably wanted me to write a simple, having fun, wish you were here letter, but instead I poured myself into writing in my best Spanish, a fairly long letter to Galeano. My teacher was really excited to read it and said that since he was such a beloved person in Latin America, we were really going to work hard on making it a perfect letter. So I learned a lot of Spanish doing this, but when I got home with a great letter and nowhere to send it, this being way before the World Wide Web, all I knew was that Galeano lived somewhere in Uruguay. And I had a suspicion that if I addressed the envelope with Eduardo Galeano, Uruguay, it would probably get to him, but I wasn't about to take chances with my masterpiece. So for about a year, whenever I ran into somebody who specialized in Latin America, I'd ask for help. One woman told me she went through shoe boxes of notes hoping to find something for me, but no one was able to give me what I needed to send my letter. And one day I was in a library and it occurred to me to ask a librarian at the reference desk. I'm looking for an address of a Uruguayan writer named Eduardo Galeano. She pulled a massive book from the shelf behind her and within seconds had the info I had just spent the last year asking around for. So my feelings about librarians. And that was years before I heard about the Library Association's refusal to hand over our private information to the government, or about their promotion of banned books. More about that later, I'm sure, from our speaker. Oh, and yes, I did receive a nice letter back from Galeano. I'm going to speak about censorship from personal experience. I grew up, as many of us did, during the McCarthy era. So raise your hand if you can name two people, two Blacks that are mentioned in our history textbooks? Anyone? Rick.
Crispus Attucks is one.
Oh, really? Oh, we didn't even get him.
And in high school I did a paper on Thurgood Marshall, actually. So
oh, well, that was somebody that was even somebody that I didn't hear about. Yeah. That's interesting. I don't remember when I first heard of Attucks, but it wasn't my first U.S. history book. I remember George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, two men not known for challenging the system, a scientist and an accommodationist, as being the only Blacks we were allowed to know about. I don't remember at what point in my adult life I first heard of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but it took my discovery of the children's section of the Carson branch of the county library, looking for books for my classroom in Compton, that I suddenly plunged into the history outside that tiny window I'd been permitted to look through as a child. And I remember being very upset about why I was deprived of these really exciting stories when I was growing up. Had the government been censoring textbooks, or were the publishing companies censoring themselves, either in response to McCarthyism or to the right-wing views of their owners? Whether it was governmental or capitalist censorship, they deprived our generation of true education. Now, I've come to realize there are different forms of censorship. Social media companies shutting down accounts of progressive organizations is censorship. Governments imprisoning journalists like Mumia Abu Jamal and Julian Assange on fake charges is censorship. Assassinating them like they did Ruben Salazar and Shireen Abu Akleh is censorship. Governments refusing to condemn these crimes against journalists is censorship. The generations that followed mine were treated to an education opened up to them by struggles and demands, mostly by communities of color. This was ongoing, not confined to the 60s, nor to questions of racial justice. I remember in the 80s when some Vietnam vets organized a presentation of the Los Angeles Board of Education, demonstrating the lack of coverage of the anti-war movement in some widely used high school textbooks. In her response, the board president, one Jackie Goldberg, told us that the only problem with the presentation is it didn't go far enough. And she proceeded to talk about the poor representation of the Reconstruction era. And that was in the 80s, and there's been more since. Freedom is indeed a constant struggle. It's an exciting evolution from censored textbooks to liberated ones. Now the fascist movement across the US wants to return us back to the 50s. Will we let them?
So it's been good. We wanted to do this as part of a series that we're doing of we've had teachers like Carol Francis and other board members talk about what they're going through and the challenges that teachers have had in the system now, being able to just speak about the actual facts around history and around even doing things like getting kids to think critically about actual issues. So it's really great to have Joyce McIntosh from the Freedom to Read Foundation. She's the assistant program director for the group. And it's an organization dedicated to First Amendment education, litigation, and advocacy. So, she's worked in a public library outside of Chicago, which is, what was it? It's probably a sweltering 3 degrees now since we started talking. And
It's 3.
see, it's going up. And you know, she also has done anti-racism, the training program. So we're really, really glad to have you here. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me get it in slide mode here. All right, is everyone able to see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you, Rick, for inviting me. And wow, what a group of people. I'm realizing this morning that I'm surrounded by peacekeepers and justice promoters and world citizens. And that means that with access to information, when any one person or family is prevented from being able to access information, it's our role, all of ours, to help step in. And this morning I was thinking of ways that the work that we're doing intersects librarians and those working for peace and justice. And what came to my mind are a few examples within the library world. Last year, my friend and fellow librarian Ray James was given the Freedom to Read Foundation's Roll of Honor Award. This is an annual award given to one person, and it's like a lifetime achievement award for intellectual freedom work. And Ray has worked nonstop for close to 3 decades on behalf of prisoners' rights to access information. Ray made the decision to become a librarian as a young person in prison because he wanted to finish his college degree. Today, he's integral in writing the American Library Association's document, Ensuring Access to Information for Incarcerated People. I thought of this morning about my grad school advisor. I went to Wayne State University in Detroit, and my advisor, Dr. Linda Baker, became a faculty member there because she wanted to do research about the information needs of sex workers. She left her job as a nurse for AIDS patients in San Francisco, moved to Detroit, and the way she conducted her research there was by taking a van downtown at night and providing healthcare needs, library information, library cards, library materials about health and safety for sex workers. And libraries are often outside of the police station and the fire department. We're often the only heating and cooling shelters in towns. And then finally, last year, the Freedom to Read Foundation hosted a 2-day virtual symposium where intellectual freedom and social justice meet, a call to action. And that was such an interesting program. And we're going to carry the conversation this winter by having a special edition of the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy dedicated to the intersection of social justice and intellectual freedom. So I feel like librarians, we're here. We're in this conversation, doing the work with you. And the other thing I'd note in my introduction is that librarianship is the only literal epiphany that I've ever had. I worked in newspapers before. I was sitting in an office on a Friday night in Lansing, Michigan. That's as warm and friendly in winter as where I'm sitting right now. And it was like a bolt of light. You should go to library school. That had never crossed my mind. I was not someone ready to jump into grad school. I waited at least 8 years after my undergrad. So I always feel like I'm called to be here for a reason. And my work that I started out doing in librarianship was on intellectual freedom and censorship training. I used to train the new librarians at my public library and lead trainings. And I went I've been a consultant with the Freedom to Read Foundation for 10 years. And a couple of years ago, when the challenges started rolling in at 90 miles an hour, I was asked to work directly with FTRF and the American Library Association, doing what I'm doing. And I felt that if I had ignored it at this time in history, I would have been neglecting that call. So here I am, and I'm really honored to be talking with all of you based on the work that I hear you're doing. I'm going to try to keep you awake, so I'll rip through this, and then I look forward to a conversation and some questions. Just a little background about public libraries. I'll note that Steve knows 90% of this, but we'll just keep moving. We are the only limited public forum. That means that the public library is set aside for one purpose, protected by the First Amendment, and that's to give people access to information and access to the building where that content is communicated. Private libraries are not a limited public forum, but librarians there still abide by the same professional ethics that I'll get into in a minute. Private companies are not that sort of public forum, but we're also not a broad public forum. You can't go in the same way you could go on the public sidewalk or the park if you get a permit and give a political speech. You can't do that within the library. So we are able to have time, place, and manner restrictions. But those restrictions, usually set up by our library trustees, must still function within the law and within the First Amendment. So we just can't make up rules. I'm going to share a couple definitions here for intellectual freedom and censorship, just so we're on the same page. What I want to note about this definition of censorship is the fact that it's not just banning content, right? It's not just removing a book. Censorship is if you restrict materials, if you label materials, if you move them to a special area and therefore make it hard to access materials. If you put a little purple sticker on every LGBTQ book, I don't think many teens are going to feel comfortable walking to that area, removing that book, showing it to people. So censorship can include removing, labeling, and restricting materials. So librarians have a number of guiding principles in the same way that an attorney does, that a healthcare professional does. I'm noting the freedom to read statement because it has been around for a while. Carol Francis, I was thinking about your history with censorship in the McCarthy era. So this was enacted in 1953. It's been regularly updated. So in the late 70s to mid 80s, I forget the exact year, a freedom to view statement came out. And that was because all of a sudden libraries had videotapes for loan. So the freedom to view kicked in. I'm just going to point out one line in the Library Bill of Rights and one in the Code of Ethics. And this is the tightrope that librarians feel they are walking right now. We must strike that balance between providing materials and information, presenting all points of view on current and historic topics, and affirming the inherent dignity and rights of every person, working to recognize and dismantle systemic and individual biases, confront inequity and oppression, and enhance diversity and inclusion. So we are called to provide access to information for all people, sharing all points of view. And we are called to be the most welcoming place and, work for racial justice, LGBTQ justice, economic justice and awareness. So those are the documents that guide how we go about our work. Challenges are changing. So when I did training sessions a decade ago, one parent would come in and say, I don't want Harry Potter, it deals with witchcraft, get it off the shelf. We'd have a conversation and allow them to, their right is to fill out a reconsideration form. That's their First Amendment right as well. We'd work through the process. If you can't prove that there's a good reason why a material should be removed, it can't be removed. And a judge would have to determine if something was actually obscene, harmful to minors, or pornographic. We'll get into that later. But, challenges were sort of, I used to tell people, you may never run into this. You might just have conversations with patrons. You need to know this stuff. Now we're in a different world, as all of you know. Now we're experiencing partisan advocacy groups targeting school boards and library boards, disruptions at meetings and at programs, challenges to diverse content, books addressing racism, and just lots of work around elections, board recalls, and even criminal complaints targeting library staff, educators, and materials. I want to make one note. I am probably not going to answer questions till the end, but please do, if you think about them, type them into chat, and that way we can address them all. So what else is happening? We're seeing state legislation. Somebody mentioned Florida and what Governor DeSantis is doing there. We're seeing bans on teachers about what topics they can discuss. People are attempting to remove legal defenses to obscenity. And organizations like EBSCO, First Search, a number of the database vendors are being challenged as well for content that's distributed through the library. So the numbers in 2019, pre-pandemic, 377 challenges. Now, when I say a challenge, that means someone has filled out a report to the American Library Association saying this is happening. Doesn't necessarily mean a book is removed. It means they noted that it was challenged. You'll see that the number of titles is different because now these groups are handing in lists of 20, 30, 100 titles they want removed. During the pandemic, everything went down. The focus instead was on masking mandates. 2021, it rose to 729 challenges, and I guarantee you when we finish the report, 2022 will be double that. So how do we deal with this from a librarian perspective, but also as community members? For librarians, we must have sound policies. We must know the law. We must understand viewpoint discrimination. For community members, run for local office, your library board, school board, or local government. Join community members, look at Unite Against Book Bans for their toolkit that gives suggestions for talking points, letter writing ideas, etc. Support the Merit Fund. I'll share more about that in a bit. Basically, do what you are already doing. Your work is appreciated. So when I say we have to have sound policies, again, these policies must fit within the First Amendment and they must follow state laws. So we have a collection development policy, which shares how the librarians determine what they buy and why they buy it. We're not just throwing up titles and saying, this looks like fun. We are choosing titles that are an appropriate fit. They are well reviewed. So we have a collection development policy that says what we'll buy and why. And that can be influenced to some degree by our community. That will determine what languages those books are in, what information we need to provide. We'll look at the census, we'll look at our community. Within that collection development policy is a reconsideration policy. This is the key with managing all of these challenges. So we'll look at that. It has a patron behavior policy. And in this day and time, I like to remind people that you follow that when you're attending a board meeting. You follow that if you're a trustee. You follow that if you're a staff member. It applies to everyone at all times. We must have meeting room and display policies that talk about our meeting room use, because if you open the meeting room up to one group, you open it up to all groups without bias. You provide that access to all groups. And internet use policies. So these are the time, place, and manner restrictions that as a limited public forum we can have. So this is what we hear all the time right now. The number one place for challenges is in our schools. The number two place is in our public libraries. And right now we're hearing groups like Moms for Liberty, No Left Turn in Education, all sorts of groups coming out of the woodwork saying, this is harmful to minors, this is pornographic, this is obscenity. What's important to keep in mind, two things. As a parent, there are probably some books on those lists I'm not going to let my elementary boys look at. But the thing to keep in mind is we provide choice for all people to choose what they check out. We don't determine what their family can check out. We provide access to information. We're not defending content. And that these are all legal definitions. You can't just say this book's obscene and this book is obscene. We have a right to share our opinion. This is a sample of what a materials reconsideration form looks like. The key here is, have you read, viewed, or listened to the entire work? And I'll explain why that's critical in a few minutes. If that isn't selected, you don't really have a challenge. So in Miller versus California, 1973, this has become known as the Miller test. A judge is likely to look at this test when a challenge comes to that level. And the material must meet all three parts of this to be found obscene in a court. And I want to note that 2 out of the 3 points of the Miller test say the material must be taken as a whole. That's where someone can get up in a board meeting, they can hold up one picture and say this is pornographic. That doesn't make the work pornographic. Harmful to minors. Same as the Miller test, but you're taking it in the context of the age of the people that it's for. And the oldest age within that range is what the material's based on. And I really want to point out viewpoint discrimination. It is a violation to remove a title based on viewpoint discrimination. A librarian can't say, you know what, I don't want to have anything with LGBTQ content. We're not going to collect it. We're going to remove it from the library. That's pure viewpoint discrimination. I don't want any of this woke race stuff. Pure viewpoint discrimination. So it's sometimes important to talk with fellow patrons and parents and trustees and remind them of this process, this legal status. So like I said, I always keep in mind we're ensuring access to information, not defending content. We are a limited public forum. I should note too that when students walk in that school door at a public school, they do not lose their First Amendment rights. Their First Amendment rights are protected. One thing I'm not getting into here is privacy. I'm feeling like I should have added a couple slides on that topic, but I want to note that 48 states have solid patron privacy laws. So in the Illinois compiled statute, it covers all ages. In other words, privacy of patron records covers everyone, elementary through adult. But it's useful to know what the privacy law is in your state and be aware of that. Your privacy is protected, and that's critical. So what are librarians doing on aside from these challenges that are rolling in our individual public libraries that our teachers and library educators are getting every day? What are some ways that we can respond to that? Unite Against Book Bans is a great start. This is a collaborative with the American Library Association. Organizations can join on. It is nonpartisan. The statistics are nonpartisan. And what I love about this is that there's a challenge toolkit on this website, uniteagainstbookbans.org. In the toolkit, there are talking points that you can share with people if they're going to go to a meeting, board of trustees for a school or a public library. So they're great statistics and talking points to share. I encourage you to become familiar with Unite Against Book Bans. The Merit Fund has been around forever, but now the need is increasing. There were some years where we didn't receive any applications to this fund. Other years, maybe one, at the most two. Last year, we received 7. So the Merit Fund is not affiliated with the Freedom to Read Foundation or ALA. It is a separate fund for librarians who are facing discrimination in the workplace or defending intellectual freedom and their jobs being threatened. They can apply to receive a grant that will maybe cover their housing for a month or cover their insurance or help them have the funds to retain an attorney for themselves. So the one problem, this is not, it's not tax deductible, just a heads up. We're working to change that. But it has been structured as a separate fund. And it's made such a difference. All of this is anonymous. We don't share who is receiving this. Lots of people are at risk at work. The Freedom to Read Foundation, the primary organization I work with, the difference between us and the American Library Association, because we literally work in the same office. We have the same director. I work on their education initiatives. I often speak on behalf of the American Library Association. The key word that's different is litigation. We become involved in briefs. Our general counsel often shares legal advice. We share, we can provide expert witnesses in challenge cases that are going to court. I wanted to point this out. This came down last summer in Virginia Beach about genderqueer, which is the most challenged book right now, and A Court of Mist and Fury. And what I liked about this determination is that the judge literally laid out the fact that you could not call the books obscene. So FTRF, we're the folks you talk to more to become involved in education, advocacy, but litigation is our key difference. The American Library Association has an active Office for Intellectual Freedom. We provide challenge support. So librarians who are going through a challenge can give us a phone call. We encourage them to use their personal email or to make a phone call so they can't be FOIA'd, because that's really blown up a lot. So we can have an anonymous conversation. We will provide support to them, help them navigate a challenge. Sometimes we encourage state library associations to share a letter of support. I note that because if you've seen some of these articles right now, the American Library Association is, being portrayed as this huge liberal monolith, and many people don't want a large organization swooping in to their town's politics, to their town's business. They are more likely to listen. Trustees may want to listen to someone local, someone at the state level, a local ACLU attorney, a local state library association member or leader. So we work quite often behind the scenes with different organizations to provide support. And finally, anybody can can report a challenge. If you're at a meeting and someone gets up and starts going on about a book being obscene, if you're in the public library and someone is asking to have books removed, anybody can report it. You don't need to be a librarian. You can report as a community member. That's it. So I don't usually share my headshot of my tat, but I thought that for this group, it may not be inappropriate since your local had a nice stub of peace on it. So anyways, I thought I'd share that headshot with you. I would like now to just hear your questions and talk with you about this, and to cover anything that you feel I left out or any questions you have. I realize that was a little bit of a whirlwind, so I'm glad to entertain any other topics related to it.
Now, this has been really good. Thank you very much. It's very informative, and just to know about the different aspects of the Freedom to Read Foundation, what you're doing with ALA and organizations like the Merit Fund is good to know that there's a centralized there's centralized work going on to help protect the First Amendment. And I did want to say one thing that I read that I thought was great was it was proposed, someone proposed that anytime someone proposes a book ban, that they have to write a book report on that book and give it to an English teacher to be graded. I thought that was awesome.
They'd be demonstrating they read the entire work.
Exactly, yeah.
There you go. There's a number of hands. Do you want to go ahead and call on folks and monitor that and I'll answer, or do you want me? Okay.
No, we'll do that. And for those of you who are new on the call, in reactions, you can go to raise hand. You can do that, and then after you're called on and your question is answered, if you can put it down. So, Rose, you had a question.
Yes, and maybe the first, I've got two actually, two things. Maybe the first one is naivety. I'm sure it is, in fact, because I've only lived in California and otherwise in Europe. But you were talking about the legal support. I mean, I was a school administrator and we always had legal support behind us if a parent sued us or sued the school or anything, which is a major issue if you're a school administrator. And the union always backed us. I mean, our librarians, I suppose, in some places have nobody behind them at all who will support them if something happens?
So there's such a broad range. You're absolutely right. One of the first things I ask is, are you union? Do you have support from your union? And then we go down to that micro level. Is your principal supportive? Is your superintendent supportive? How about your board of trustees? Because right now there are schools that are well supported and the union has their back as far as representing them legally. There are also situations though where a principal or superintendent will say they'll go in and pull a book, or they'll erase it from the catalog, or they'll say remove all the books related to this. I tell librarians, you know what, if you need and want to keep doing what you're doing, do not feel like you need to die on that hill right then. I mean, you can let them know we have a policy, we legally have to follow it, but people feel like they have to abide by their principal or superintendent or get fired. So there are many schools too where sometimes a librarian will feel like, you know what, I'm not going to buy it. I've seen it on the list. I've dealt with this. So a lot of that sort of soft censorship takes place too. So there is such a range of support. Some greatly supported and some not at all.
Thank you. My other question, I'll hold on for the moment. So I'm going to keep my hand up if that's okay, Rick, because you have other people put their hands up. I don't want to hog the meeting.
No worries. So Fernando, you had your hand up.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It's really informative. But I'm much concerned of what's really happening here in the U.S. It's like, like the Guantanamo, people are getting charged without due process of the law, and there's another one like Julian Assange that in prison now, and also exposing the crime of the government itself. And so how do you respond with many of this? It seems to me it's like the Patriotic Act. That's what's happening here in the U.S. The NDDA, Patriotic Act or something like that. Maybe if you can help me to at least understand many of these issues, because it seems to me, I mean, this is just my thought. It seems to me that the government itself is in violation of many of this constitution, and yet they preach democracy, and we are here in shambles. I can give a lot of example like spending. It's like unlimited expenditure, but at the same time, the people here are suffering. Maybe if you can at least give me some light on that.
Fernando, just to narrow it down a little bit, in the how are you asking in the aspect of what the American Library Association is doing?
No, but in relation to the First Amendment.
Right.
I can
Uh,
briefly respond to that. It won't, and Fernando, it certainly won't capture all of what you've stated, which is true. It's terrifying, the threat to the Constitution and to the First Amendment. Where I maintain hope with all of this is in the fact that so far, judges are upholding the First Amendment. Judges are following the Miller test. And no judge has taken the bait and said, yes, arrest the librarian. Even in Texas with situations like the abortion rule changing. So when the abortion ruling came down, that was very scary for people who work in the information field, because all of a sudden they were like, can we share anything related to abortion? People were telling them you can't. That's not true. What they cannot do is literally aid and abet an illegal abortion. Doesn't mean you can't share information. So I maintain hope because so far I am seeing judges, well, one, I'm not seeing a lot get to that level because it's fairly crazy, but two, I'm seeing judges not going down that road.
That's good to know. Carol Francis, you've had your hand up for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm wondering about, you talk about they're saying that a certain book is obscene. I think the Harry Potter one about it being promoting witchcraft is very interesting. But how about like in Florida and other places where they're saying that teachers can't speak and textbooks can't use books that make one ethnic group, namely whites, feel uncomfortable? Well, what if Black said, you know, this book that leaves us out makes us uncomfortable, and just turns it around? Could you speak on the whole, the white supremacist challenge to books that speak on racism as a systemic problem in the US? Thank you.
So what I can speak to related to challenges is that it's clear viewpoint discrimination. And that's where it becomes illegal to just remove books for that sweeping reason. In Florida, Texas, Virginia, a lot of states right now, it's becoming more and more critical. And I should note that the American Library Association is a nonpartisan organization. And in order to keep our nonprofit status, we are able to get involved in politics. What we can do, however, is help our state chapters, help with United Against Book Bans and other groups. We encourage community members to start working together in a grassroots way to take it to the political local level, take it to the state legislative level, and just fight, fight, fight. Because that's where these changes are being made. It's really hard, and therefore that's where groups like Unite Against Book Bans come in handy, or for just aiding community organizing around topics. Because that, what you're speaking of, is exactly what's caused the big shift in challenges. And where my colleagues at ALA and I come in at it is we have to take it one specific instance at a time, because at the local level, we have to say, you have to follow your policies. A judge will disregard it. If you have your principal walk in there and remove all the books related to 1619 project, and they'll say, well, we can because, you know, the governor told us we could, or whatever, the ex-president told us we could, or whatever. If you have a policy written in place that your school board has enacted, you legally have to follow that policy. And a local judge is going to hold you to that policy. It's becoming harder now that things are going to the state legislative level, because then we start having to connect. We try to connect librarians with a local ACLU attorney or a local employment attorney. We start having to work with the State Library Association and their legislative efforts. So it's pervasive. You're spot on. Really, racism, homophobia have sort of trumped reason when it comes to this topic. I'm from Southwest Michigan, and it's where I went to library school and where I started out in journalism. And with many people in Michigan, whether they were Michigan militia and my neighbors, and whether we agreed or not, I could usually build a bridge by talking with them about my First Amendment rights. And when I started training librarians, I would talk with people about their First Amendment rights. Within the last 2 years, that is not a topic that people relate to as much. And so I end up talking with people more about their right to choose materials for their own child and for their own family. So the conversation is shifting. The challenges are going from a local level to a legislative level. And it is, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, I can understand that. Let me go through a few more hands here. Steve, you had your hand up.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Such a terrific program. A wonderful writer, Nat Hentoff, years ago, wrote a book called Free Speech for Me, Not for Thee, which captures your last comment that people do talk about free speech and the First Amendment when it comes to their favorite topic or interest, but then are only too happy to turn it around. I too have a bunch of questions, and I'll go back in line to allow others to speak. But in the area of hate speech, there's a lot of confusion, and people will throw out the term hate speech as if it's an established exception to the First Amendment. There are specific exceptions to the First Amendment. You've been speaking about obscenity, for example. There are true threats. There's insurrection and incitement, which has taken a lot of focus lately. But because otherwise protected speech may be offensive or controversial from a racial standpoint, is not legal grounds to censor it. So how does your foundation deal with that? And do you have, in fact, a broader question, do you have substantive examples on your website or otherwise that will guide librarians to the definitions of the various exceptions to the First Amendment and what is protected and what is not protected?
The answer to the last part of your question is we don't have much on our website as far as those specifics. We do tend to do a lot of education around it, especially with our FTRF's general counsel, Teresa Chamara. We're working on resurrecting the Lawyers for Libraries programs just to educate people on that exactly. We have webinars sometimes on like what's fake news. In other words, what's how to handle information. I draw on two things to answer your question, and I'm not an attorney, so I can't sufficiently cover all of it. I don't feel like I have a thorough response, but I'll give you two partial ones. The first one is that when I talk to a librarian who calls me up and says, somebody just asked me to buy Johnny the Walrus, and it is a book that is considered by many to be transphobic. They will say, you know what, I don't want to buy this, I don't like this, etc. We talk with them, what is in your collection development policy? What does your collection development policy say? For example, I used to work at Elmhurst Public Library, and if we got 3 patron requests for a title, we'd buy it. We'd buy 1 copy for every, like, you know, if we got 3, we'd buy a copy. If we got like 5, we'd buy X number of copies. That's how we kept Harry Potter on the shelf for everyone. But we have to rely on those collection development policies being wisely written. Sometimes a person will say that they will not purchase something that is not scientifically true or based in fact. For example, you may not buy an Alex Jones title because it is conspiracy theory, and it is truly conspiracy theory. You may not buy a book that's a Holocaust denial title. It gets really hard. I noticed someone mentioned Huckleberry Finn. That's where you just have to be on that tightrope. We will provide access to information presenting all points of view on current and historic works or incidents. But as my boss would say, you have to let everyone use the meeting room. That does not mean that they aren't going to use a meeting room that you've decorated with rainbow flags. That does not mean that they're not going to be hosting their, you know, kind of right-wing meeting or however, whatever group is there without being surrounded by the welcome of diversity. I don't think I have a much more thorough answer. Did that touch on some of it?
Well, that's such a good example you gave earlier. So librarians will consult. I'm trying to understand the scope of your work. Librarians, when there's a challenge, may consult with you. How do we handle this? We're trying to follow our guidelines, but someone wants to buy 12 copies of Johnny the Walrus. And how would you respond?
So I would say, do you have a policy about donations? Because quite often you'll write in there, we will only accept a donated copy of something that we would select. And our collection development policy says, maybe it says we buy through these vendors, which is problematic in its own right, because lots of times authors of color may, or authors that aren't as known, may be self-publishing, they may be with a different imprint, but quite often it will say, this is who we buy from. It must be professionally reviewed. And it must, if it doesn't fit these conditions, we won't accept the donation or we won't purchase it. So you end up looking at those policies, but again, those policies must not violate the First Amendment. The Epoch Times may be a good example. People can come back and say, no, this fits your policy. This is acceptable within your policy. You need to add it. Same with Huckleberry Finn. We're going to, it's going to be maintained. It's really hard. They're gray area questions that we're having to apply, formal rules to. We want to stay legal and we want to stay ethical and not prohibit access to information for someone who might just want to do research about a topic. We don't have the ability to judge why someone wants to use materials.
That's a good point. I was thinking that you probably come across one of the things that's been challenged is Allen Ginsberg's Howl, right? And I think it's funny how people have a way of finding out about challenged books no matter what the deal is. So there's a service called Canopy, which in most of the United States, if you have a library card, you get for free.
Yeah.
So there are some libraries where you can't check out a copy of Howl, but you can see a documentary on Allen Ginsberg where he's reading the entirety of Howl.
Yep.
So I think there's interesting things happening. Michael, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I would like to get your contact information because I was very curious about a few of the things you talked about at the beginning of your presentation, both about the question of freedom to read in prisons and also the work that you mentioned that have been done with information to sex workers. This is in relation also to KPFK, where we have programming around both prisons and sex workers. I'd like to see if we can get them in touch.
Michael, can you share with me what that acronym stands for? KPF.
Oh, KPFK is the Pacifica affiliate station, radio station here in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Pacifica Radio has BAI in New York, WPFW in DC, KPFT in Houston, KPFK here in LA, and KPFA in Berkeley, and then 200 some odd affiliates around the country and community radio stations. So yeah, we do programming we have a show called Think Outside the Cage, which corresponds and communicates with formerly incarcerated people and their families. We have a program called Body Politics that looks at sex work and other related issues. And I publish a newspaper called Turning the Tide, which I've been sending into prisons for about 35 years. And it's increasingly difficult to get into the prisons. They're more and more restrictive in what they allow and how they allow it. A lot of the prisons are controlling all correspondence for everyone. It used to be just like certain, Muslim prisoners or political prisoners were targeted. And now it's much more generalized. So I'm very curious about that. I want to go back, though, to ICUJP. This organization was founded after 9/11. And, our motto is, religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. But one of the big things that happened after 9/11, and the librarians were, I think, in the lead in dealing with it, was the USA Patriot Act and the whole question of tracking what people were reading and what people were looking at on the computers in libraries. And I'm curious if that's still an issue. I think I do want to raise the question of fascism and the F word, because I do think that what we're seeing is a transformation, although you talked about legislative action, but a lot of the legislative action, like the Texas abortion law, was designed around actually encouraging a mass base for repression and targeting of people, who are considered subversive or immoral. And I think that that's a critical difference from although there was an upsurge of patriotism and stuff at 9/11, but this is a different phenomenon now. It's much more concerted, conscious base building of fascist forces. And I think the libraries are terrain where that's, taking place, as well as the schools and prisons. Thanks.
Did you have a question, or were you just commenting?
Well, I'm curious about the particular question of privacy. Are you involved with protecting the privacy of borrowers and what you think about that perspective? That I understand that you're nonpartisan, but I think this is beyond the question of partisanship.
Librarians are still very involved in that. In fact, yesterday afternoon, my director of the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom shared a talk about privacy with librarians in Massachusetts. That's still critical. Even more so now that everything's open, everything's available. And it's interesting because different states, when they write patron privacy laws, some of them will put in laws related to whether the databases at the library can gather your personal information, whether they can gather the information of minors, or whether they need to find a way around that, whether they are not allowed to gather that information. Privacy is still key, and it's interesting. So I was a student at Wayne State University during 9/11, and that's got Detroit is one of the largest Middle Eastern communities in the United States. And the Patriot Act, that was awful and swift, right? When you feel like people are looking over your shoulder to see if you're checking out an almanac or an encyclopedia, to see if you're checking out something about bomb building. So librarians still are very strict about what information we can share, what patron information is held, whether that information is backed up or whether it just disappears. Privacy is still a key issue, even more now that the speed at which information flies, the immediacy with which you can dox someone. It's a different world. So, Michael, thank you for bringing that up. I put my email in the chat, and I'd be glad to figure out some resources of the group at ALA that works with incarcerated people. Try to find some recent articles or blog posts that we've written about privacy from our office.
Thank you very much. So we have about maybe 5-10 minutes. So I'm going to go through a couple things here. So in the chat, Dave Clennon, who's one of our board members, asked, would it be relevant to talk about government/media censorship in the time of war, Ukraine, for example, muting of dissident points of view, information warfare, AA propaganda? Opposition figures have been banned from Twitter, diminished distribution on Facebook, but those are private entities, but still, it's a factor. Complete absence of guest speakers who oppose the U.S. NATO narrative on corporate mass media. That's corporate, I think is a key word there. Are libraries affected by the government's interest in the dissemination of U.S. NATO propaganda versus dissidents? That's the question that Dave Clennon was asking in there.
I would note that the IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, has an intellectual freedom group. and they are active and involved on international narratives, and our US members are involved on looking at that big picture.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, I don't, I end up in the weeds dealing with the individual challenge situations.
Yeah.
So I'm not as aware of what they're doing currently, but that conversation is certainly taking place. And like I said, that group is IFLA. In library land, there are so many. I'm going to just check the group to make sure I have it right. That's not it.
Yeah, if you can, if you're as you're looking it up, if you can maybe put the full name in.
Yes.
I'll also, Michael put in the chat just another quick question. The role of librarians in media literacy and educating people about navigating misinformation, disinformation, and critical reading of social media. I personally think that's very important as well.
Librarians and media literacy. Yes, we have had, the Freedom to Read Foundation has hosted some basically fake news webinars. Librarians are very interested in information literacy, in teaching people in schools, but also at all ages, how you sort through whether a media outlet is sharing the news or whether they're sharing the news from a perspective. And then how you, critical reading of social media, that one's hard as well. Certainly, we talk to library professionals about how to handle their institution's social media. Quite often, we talk to them about, there are some instances where we say, don't allow comments. Truly make this a vehicle of information about the organization's events and activities. Share with people what they can access, but don't have that become a social media forum. So librarians are still very involved in media literacy and education, especially school librarians.
No, that's good. Very good to know. Let me go back to, I know a couple of people wanted to do follow-ups. If we can have Rose, I know you still had a question, and Steve, of course, if you after that.
Yeah, my primary question was actually answered because Steve asked kind of the same question, which was great. But I just wanted to share rather than ask a question here. This whole thing has got me doing a lot of navel gazing. It really has, because looking at, coming back to Florida, I just want to share this, the new college thing and the thing that DeSantis is doing right now. I went on their website and I looked to see, and to me it looks like a wonderful college. But when looked at the website of the other one, the one up in Michigan that Betsy DeVos went to, and that looks terrible to me. And I thought, well, if I was a taxpayer paying for this one that I really don't like the look of, I would maybe be backing DeSantis. It's a very, very difficult question. As you say, there's a really hard line you have to go down to work out. So it's not really a question, it's more an expression of something that I think ICUJP might want to discuss at some point, because it's not just one side, it's not right against left, it's also both sides. That was all.
That's where I think about the changing landscape so much. So I'm from Southwest Michigan, Betsy's backyard, not literally, but awfully darn close. And, there's a library, it's in Patmos Township, Michigan. It's just west of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it's the fastest growing county and fastest growing township in the state. And in that township, they're run by, I think it's a county entity, Ottawa County. The Ottawa County group of citizens just turned over their county board, fired their current county manager. Patmos Township went for a library referendum and it was voted down because a group of citizens said, we don't want any LGBTQ content. It's so hard to look at that and say, do you realize you're looking at probably 0.01% of the holdings? But they said, okay, we're going to take this to the referendum. We're encouraging people to turn it down. Well, they turned it down and then sat back and say, whoa, that means we just defunded our public library. So they took it back to a second vote because they thought, well, this is nuts. We, just defunded the library. We're going to take it back to the voters. They did it again. Again, this is the fastest growing township in the state of Michigan. But because of the huge economic backing, because of the message, that's really happening many places. And that's where it becomes a situation of grassroots organizing, being critical, message management being critical, talking about all the things that the public and school libraries provide to all the people who can't afford a computer, people who need help looking for jobs, people who can't afford books for their kids, people who want to take their kids or their family to free, awesome programming, the many, many programs and services that are provided. And instead they're focusing on this topic that's so minuscule in the public library collection. And it is exasperating watching it happen. In Louisiana, the Attorney General is going after librarians right now. That individual's probably running for governor in this next season. And I worry about that becoming sort of Florida Part 2. Again, though, my hope is acknowledging that so far, no judges have gone down that road. They started the lock her up type thing with several librarians in St. Tammany Parish. And the local police were like, no, there is no pornography in this library. You sent me in to search. No, I'm not breaking my code of ethics to do something that's not legal or right. So that's where I just continue to send up hope that rational voices will win out and that people can become involved and organize.
Yeah. You reminded me of an instance when I was living in Santa Barbara. I had a friend of mine who was a librarian, worked in the reference library, part of the Santa Barbara Library. And, we would have discussions about serious things, but I came in once, the guy is from New York. So during one of the World Series, he had this Yankee pennant by the information desk. And I said that was violating my sensibilities for pornography. He didn't do anything about it, though.
Yes.
Steve, you had a question.
I think what we've learned today is librarians are an endangered species, and both locally and statewide and nationally, we should all do everything we can when the opportunity arises to support local librarians. Much of what's been said reminds me that we have a First Amendment because there are a lot of things we can put up to a vote in America. A lot of things are based on a democratic vote, but individual rights and what people read is not subject to a majority vote. And through these school board battles, people feel they can vote to exclude an entire class of literature and content. And we've just got to keep pushing back at that. As a retired lawyer, I appreciate, Joyce, that the courts are by and large the bulwark and the last resort, but it takes money and time to work through the courts. So a lot of these laws, the New Yorker this week reports 43 states have passed or are considering various forms of restrictions and book banning. So these things last on the books for a while. Anderson Cooper last night, if people can track down CNN, interviewed a teacher in Florida, and they showed a photograph of that yellow police tape over her bookshelf because her principal ordered her to remove every book from her bookshelf because of concern whether the school was violating the law. So the chaos that these laws introduce itself is a form of censorship and intimidation, because while this is being worked out, students are being denied access. But I want to quickly emphasize that it works both ways, and some speakers, Rose and others, we've got to be careful that in our own agenda of things we disagree with, we don't impose censorship. At Stanford University, a student was observed reading Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography written in prison. He was reading the book by himself on a table or a park bench, and he is now being subject to investigation by Stanford because of his insensitivity of reading Mein Kampf in public. That's very dangerous, because if we go down that road, whatever any person in power's particular agenda is, whether we agree with it or don't agree with it, we're in very troubled times. My question is, does the Freedom to Read Foundation or maybe the Library Association, Julian Assange was mentioned recently, and many of us are concerned about the impact on freedom of the press that the prosecution of Julian Assange poses. So does FTRF or the Library Association or the Freedom, will you file amicus briefs? Will you take public positions when there's a direct threat to freedom to read?
We often do. And it's not always the as you've noted, it doesn't always end up being the popular position. I don't have the information in front of me as far as what statements either organization have made regarding Julian Assange. I can give you what is compared to that, a very lightweight example. If you recall, there was a cheerleader a year or two ago. The cheerleader case, the Freedom to Read Foundation was part of that amicus brief. And a cheerleader didn't get on the team, tweeted a ton of expletives, got censored, took it to court, and her First Amendment rights were violated. Now, was it horrible sportsmanship? Yeah. Do you think she's going to get on that team? Probably not now, if she wasn't before. But you do end up having to sometimes take the more strict First Amendment rules into consideration.
Thank you. And we'll be in touch on many of these topics with you. Thank you so much.
I'm looking at some of Dave's comments. Yeah, with Twitter, that's a private company, so that's a bit unnerving. As far as what body determines what is fake news, rather than determining what bodies, etc., we ended up focusing on it from a First Amendment perspective: what speech is protected, what speech is not protected, considering your sources. And that's interesting. Fact check agencies do have the power to censor. That is true.
Yep.
It takes a lot of research to do the research. But thank you to all of you for your work and your conversation today.
No worries.
Thank you, Joyce. Good luck. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Peace power.